So the flow for today is I'm going to talk with each of the panelists for about 10 minutes. Then we'll open it up for questions. So let's just get started. I'm going to start with Dick this morning. I'm going to ask him to tell us a little bit about his story. When changes in his abilities were noticed, kind of where he's at, and how all of this is unfolded. So Dick, I'm going to turn this over to you for a couple minutes.
Okay, my mic on?
Indeed
okay,
it is.
Good. I've got a couple of written comments and a little other stuff as well. But I think it's important for you to kind of know something about me if you're going to then ask questions later. So let me give you a brief history. I was born in Tennessee in 1943. I was raised in Illinois and Idaho. My dad was a pastor, so we moved around. I graduated at the bottom of my class in 1961. I think there were only 3 people left below me. And I think that's important to know because I eventually ended up with 3 college degrees. So for those of you who are students, you can come back from all the bad stuff happened earlier in your life. And the VA paid for most of my college because I spent a little time because of Lyndon Johnson sending me a letter once. Remember those days for those of you that are my age, okay? I came here to Iowa in 1973 to work as a research director for a local nonprofit. In 1980, I came to work for a banking association, eventually bought its subsidiary, and created an association management company in 1988, which I ran and owned with my wife for the next 23 years. Our client base consisted of small business, banking, medical societies, and federal law enforcement. I have a quick question. Are any of you related to the PAs that go to school or teach here, or the feet people, the podiatry group? Because you give degrees in both of those, and those are 2 of the associations that I managed and the company still manages. I spent the last few years working specifically with federal law enforcement. We managed the ATF Association, in fact started that, and also the Secret Service Association. Great bunch of guys, and women as well. I sold the company in 2011. My wife was a shareholder and sold her portion a few years prior. I was 68 at the time and began to feel like I wasn't quite right, wasn't quite there. And for those of you that have had some feeling like that, it's hard to explain, but that's the way I felt. In 2012, I went to Mayo Clinic and was diagnosed with vascular dementia. Later, it was thought to be Alzheimer's, and then even later, mild cognitive impairment. So I guess my condition is dependent upon which neurologist you talk to. And I talked to Yogi Shah, and so I'm convinced he's correct because he's the last one I talked to. So what do I do with my time? Well, my quote is, "It ain't over till it's over." So I love to cook, and I still do a lot of that. I write for my blog, which is www.dickgoodson.com. Just Google Dick Goodson blog, and you'll get it if you care about it. And I write also on foreign policy and politics. I write for the Daily Democrat, for my blog, and for the Des Moines Register. I also started a new nonprofit called the Guardian Project about a year and a half ago, whose primary mission is to raise $3.7 million for the Des Moines Police Department to pay for their body camera program, and I volunteer for the Alzheimer's Association. So how am I doing? Short answer, it depends on the moment. Really, that's very true. It depends on the moment. I recently went out and had a driving test. For those of you that believe you have some form of dementia, I think you can still drive. However, I would strongly urge you to go to Methodist and go through their process, because they will determine if you can drive and if you should drive. And that's also a good thing, because Bob has told me of stories that people got into with a problem, even though it was the other person's fault in driving, and guess what? They were diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and boom, the other person won the court suit. So I would suggest that you, if you have any form of dementia, have your driving tested, and Methodist Hospital does a wonderful job at that. You can't believe how much stuff they go through, so I would highly recommend that. I think with that, I'll stop and just wait on some Q&A where we can get into all the kind of stuff that you all want to know about.
And Dick, I've got another question for you.
Okay.
Help us understand how and to what extent your caregiver, in this case Kerry, helps and supports you?
Well, in probably all ways. Let's just take the driving issue, for instance. Every time we head out to the garage to grab one of the cars, she says, do you want to drive or do you want me to drive? And about 70% of the time, I will say, I think you should drive. And the other 30% of the time, if we're just headed down to Hy-Vee or somewhere close by, I do not do interstates, I do not do nights, okay, period. That's no matter how good I'm feeling. And so that's one question. So then she's my driver about 70% of the time. She's, I think, very cognizant of my mood swings, because you do have mood swings, and I think she's very good about recognizing that kind of thing and helping. I'm still the cook in the family. One thing I would tell you about Alzheimer's, and I'd like to see Bob, we haven't shared this, but I'd like to see what others have to say about it. If you were always really good at something and you have dementia and it starts to eat away at you, you're still probably pretty good at that. I'm still 90% a very good cook, and I still write a lot. Those things I've been very good at. Remembering names, gone. I was never very good at that. That's just almost impossible. In fact, I joke and say, I'm glad I named my kid after me. Okay, same name, don't have that problem for a while. So I think those are a few of the ways. Maybe we can get into some more, but those are a few of the ways I get support from this lovely woman here.
Thanks, Dick. We're going to turn this over to Bob now. We're going to get to the caregivers in just a few minutes to hear their side of the story. But Bob, if you would help us understand what your journey has been, how this unfolded for you when you first started noticing changes, and where you're at today.
Well, I first started at the time around 2000, the Y2K thing. I was a hired consultant working for an insurance company, making sure their programs were okay, and pointed out to them that actually 2001 is what's going to cause the problem, not 2000. Well, I was still there, but I was noticing, sometimes I thought I did this, and I also did computer consulting on the side for other things. I did databases for the Medical Society, for the state of Iowa, and I'm finding it's taking me longer to do some of the exact same stuff that should have been pretty quick. Well, pretty soon I'll call him my handler or whoever for the company I work for, places you. And they said, well, we had some complaints, Bob, that it looks like you're sitting at your computer screen doing the same thing over and over again. And I was. I'd been able to cover for a while. But so I left there and started to try to find out. So I spent about 7 years trying to find out what was the matter with me. Now, I need to throw this in. In 1984, I was on my way to work on my bicycle at the Vietnam Veterans Leadership Program, whose offices were in Merle Hay Towers. As I'm crossing by the Blue Water Tower on Merle Hay and Matt, a girl who had her license 2 weeks went around two cars and hit me at 40 miles an hour, broadside. They had to cut those two girls out of the car with the jaws of life because I just caved the top of their Buick right down on them, and then I went rolling down the street. I can remember laying there and figure, okay, fingers, toes, I hear an ambulance, I hope it's coming for me. And I didn't break anything at the time, but I've had multiple surgeries since then. My neck is fused, and coming about the time where I was having more problems, I was losing grip on my left side. I couldn't hold like a piece of paper sometimes, and this foot was starting to drag. So I cut the medical community a little slack for, that, okay, here's this obvious thing. The dementia, probably wasn't on their radar. And so finally, after 6 years, I said, hey, let's send him to a neurologist. And it took her 3 minutes to diagnose me with dementia. At which point, that can't be true. That's just my wife telling stories. And I got up and stomped off for the rest of the day. Well, she was right, and it turned out with further testing I have behavior variant frontal temporal dementia. And frontal temporal dementia is probably, when they find out more, as I think Dr. Shaw and Dr. Schmolk, my other neurologist who sometimes speaks here, probably will be 8 separate diseases when they figure out enough about the brain to sort things out. Lou Gehrig's disease, PPA, people have trouble speaking. Cerebral vascular, similar to not the one you had, but there's a whole different variety of parts in this disease, and it's the number one form of dementia affecting people under the age of 65. I work with an organization, and I'm helping a person who's only 32 years old, trying to figure out what to do. And then, the hard thing is, you have dementia, go home and get your affairs in order and prepare to die. Now, depending on the doctor you see, and most of them are not particularly well informed, you got 2 to 5 years to live. Well, I will probably die of something else other than my dementia. Could be diabetes, could be, heart something. So it's a challenge to go on, and you need to find out, focus on, you need to live for today and not worry about all the what ifs that might happen.
And that's what I wanted to ask you about, Bob. You've raised an interesting point, and I'm curious, what have you been told about your future? What should you expect? And what planning have you done to prepare for that?
Well, I've done advanced directives and things. Okay, what do you want done when you can no longer take care of yourself? Mm-hmm. Or if something happens, now my one neurologist said, now do you want feeding tubes and stuff like that? I said, no. She said, good, because otherwise you're not my patient. Mm-hmm. There's no point for people to do things to extend you laying there in the bed when you have no quality of life, in my view. Medical science can do lots of things, but they can't bring back our brain. And when we've lost a lot of abilities, it makes it hard. Now, one thing I've noticed, I've been working with the Alzheimer's Association. I worked with the Association for Frontal Temporal Dementia. I'm on their think tank with their board of directors for advanced planning, and I've also the co-chair and founder of Frontal Temporal Dementia Advocacy Resource Network to help find newly diagnosed people some services or how to answer that question, what to fill in between go home and get your affairs in order. I had one woman call and said, my husband's been diagnosed for 2 years. He's kind of the same, and they said he should be almost dead. I said, well, they were in error. There's no way to tell. But there are things we can do, even though there's no medicines really for us. There are lifestyle changes. There are exercise things. There are things we can do to maximize the quality of our life as it is now. And sometimes, whether it's with Alzheimer's or any other, dementia is like toilet paper. There's like 100 different varieties. And there's only a few people like Dr. Shaw that can sort them out and understand the differences. But eventually, as your brain deteriorates, it all kind of merges into the same mess. But we need to learn to concentrate that we are still people. We still have abilities. And in my experience, it seems like now everybody here is pretty high functioning and pretty smart. And as it's been explained to me, sometimes if you have an exceptionally full intellectual tank and say you drop 20%, you still may be well above what the flat line 50% people are. If they drop that 20%, it's going to be extremely noticeable. And so it's hard to figure out exactly what your path is going to be. So worrying about what the path is going to be takes up more energy than it is worth, because it can change and you can do one thing or the other. And so, you need to concentrate on trying to live your life. Now, my wife, who's not here today, she has a rare form of cancer that only women get, and I'm her caregiver. But she is my backup brain. I may be the brawn at the moment, but she's the one that keeps me from making really additionally stupid choices.
It's a really interesting. A really interesting story.
And I gave up driving years ago because I'm easily distracted, and I can see myself driving down the road. Look, there's a squirrel. Pretty soon, me and the squirrel are in the same tree, and hopefully there was nobody between us. And so, I used to be a deputy sheriff. I wrote the driver's manual for the state of Iowa, or rewrote it in 1984 when they needed to make it easier to read. And I always wondered, was I stupid? That's why they hired me to do that. But
Bob, thanks for your time. You've told a really interesting story that not only are you a person who might need some assistance and support from a caregiver, but you are also a caregiver for someone who needs assistance and support, a very unique situation. We're going to shift over to the caregiving side right now, and I think I'll start with my lovely wife, Terri, and ask her to share her caregiving story, how it unfolded, and some of the impacts that it's had. Terri?
Well, I'm the poster child for how not to become a caregiver. It started over 10 years ago for my dad, and it started with him needing some financial assistance. And he didn't live here. He lived up in Sioux City at the time. And I was on the phone with my uncle discussing these new issues that were coming up with my dad. And I was so baffled by it. And he said, well, your dad is a senior citizen. Well, my dad was 75 at the time. And the first thing I thought of is, no, he's not. Because I saw my dad the way I'd always seen him. Strong, independent, fiercely independent, able, smart. I couldn't see that the things that were starting to become problems, I didn't see them as permanent issues. I just saw, well, this is just a temporary setback right now. And so that denial is important because I didn't really accept that he had Alzheimer's until after he'd been in a facility for about 6 months. And every time I would go, I would say, are you sure he has Alzheimer's? Because I would see all the things he could do. And plus, many of the difficulties my dad had seemed to be similar to some of the challenges he'd had for a long time. So I was struggling with denial, and I was struggling with guilt and worrying, did I, put him in this place too soon? Couldn't he really do this on his own? What happened with Dad, and it was very interesting to hear others talk about having difficulty getting a diagnosis. I moved my dad here, began to start helping him with some things, and his ability to take care of himself was getting less and less. But again, I didn't see that as an issue. I just kept thinking, well, if we find him a different part-time job, or if we get him on the right, maybe an antidepressant, then it'll be okay. And I developed a relationship with his doctor, which is one of the things I recommend for caregivers, is with parents especially, is go to the doctor with them and develop that relationship, because you're going to need that later on. And Dad was complaining about just a variety of aches and pains that, and no matter what they tried, it just wasn't working. And so I was asking the doctor, well, couldn't we, get a referral to maybe a neurologist or a psychologist or something else, try something different? And his doctor looked at me, he said, well, he is in his 80s. And so at that moment, I had to decide, do I just cower and not challenge the doctor, or do I challenge him? And so I decided to say, well, but I'd like to try something. Isn't there something else we can do? And so then he reluctantly gave referrals to a couple of specialists, including a neurologist. But before we got to the neurologist, my dad fell and broke his ankle. And for the first time in his life, he was going to be hospitalized since the day he was born. So he was about 82 at that time. And that's when it started coming together that he was really struggling with a lot of issues. And when he was in the rehab facility, they talked a lot about his, dementia-like characteristics. But I said, well, that's not uncommon for people in later life when they're in a hospital to be confused. Again, I'm in denial. But when he went home, against the advice of the facility, they wanted him to go to skilled nursing. That's when I began to manage his medications and help him with finances. And just the thing that struck me the most about my dad was the day when he couldn't figure out to use the microwave. And that was baffling. And, John would say to me, your dad's not quite tracking, or he would, because we went through this with John's mom, and John was continuing to say to me, your dad, I think he may have some cognitive issues. But finally, we got an appointment with a neurologist who recommended an MRI, and finally my dad was diagnosed about 2 years ago with Alzheimer's. Luckily, he's a veteran, and he is in the Iowa Veterans Home in Marshalltown, and it's an excellent facility. The staff is great. I couldn't be happier about that. It was a huge relief to have him there, and he's actually stabilized a bit because he is having forced socialization, which he wasn't having in his home. He's no longer drinking, and Dad would go to the bar every night and couldn't remember, once he started drinking, how many he'd had to drink, and of course sundowners at this point. So that wasn't helping, and he's getting regular meals and forced into some activities, and the medication is always what it needs to be. So I go up to see him when I can, and my favorite thing to do with my dad is to ask him about his younger life. And I've learned a tremendous amount about our family history that I never knew before. And Dad is at his best when he's telling stories.
Terri, what was the most unexpected or difficult? Maybe focus on the difficult thing that you had to do on this journey.
I can't talk about it without tearing up, and John lived this with me when I had to take my dad's car away from him because he was driving to the bar. He continued to pass the driver's license test, but working with the doctor, reporting to the doctor that my dad was doing this drinking every night, he contacted the DOT, and my dad's license was revoked. That happened on February 6th, and it wasn't until Easter weekend that I finally had the guts to go and take his car. And we'd had many conversations about it, but my dad would say, I've been driving since I'm 13, and I knew that the one thing my dad had left in his life, because he had no hobbies, but his ability to drive was the one thing he was really good at. And he stayed pretty good at it when he was sober, but it just killed me. In fact, one day we went over there, and I said, John, we're going to sit down with Dad and explain to him once again that we're going to need to take the car this weekend. And we started the conversation with my dad, and John and I were on the sofa, and my dad just started saying, I've been driving since I was 13, I'm a great driver. And so I texted John and I said, I'm caving, help. Because at that moment,
I was sitting right beside her at the time.
I couldn't do it. I could not do it. And we left that day. But finally, on Easter weekend, we took the car, and that was really hard on everybody. So,
Terri, what advice would you give to other caregivers or those who may become caregivers?
Well, I would say, number one, give yourself time to process the emotions that come with caregiving. Dr. Bender, who was here last week, said once that worry is a wasted emotion. And guilt is a wasted emotion. And guilt was the thing that was killing me all the time because I felt so guilty for doing anything that seemed to be inhibiting to my dad's ability to be independent. And my dad's 24 years older than me, and working in that was realizing that's not that far away from me. I mean, my oldest daughter's 27. I could be that age. Am I going to go through this, and how would I want to be treated? And but I felt so guilty, and then sometimes I felt angry with my dad because of his erratic behavior, and I felt resentful sometimes for having to deal with it. Good daughters should not feel that way about caring for their parents. But luckily, I had a great support system at home. My husband and my mother's in Omaha. She has dementia. My brother's her caregiver, and I have another sister and a brother. And luckily, the four of us have really supported each other in this, and they were able to help me a lot when I couldn't do things. And I was able to talk about these feelings and process them. And I had to walk through those difficult feelings so that I could become more compassionate with my dad and more compassionate with myself. So process feelings, have somebody that you can talk to about it. Be an advocate. Consider yourself an advocate for that person. And one of the biggest things is make that relationship with the doctor, because eventually the relationship with the doctor was critical in our ability to get the car away from my dad and get him the kind of services and placement that he needed. And then ask for help, which is just, if you're a caregiver, the last person you're going to ask for help for is yourself. The last person you're going to take time for is yourself. You become so wrapped up in the other person's needs, at least I did. But it's so critically important to recognize I can't do everything. And that's what I had to come to for myself, is to realize I could not change this diagnosis. I could not change the trajectory for my dad. I couldn't convert him back to the person that I continued to want to see him as. And I had to accept that, and accept that I could only do what I could do, and I couldn't do all of it. And so the example I'll give you for asking for help is that when my dad went to the Iowa Veterans Home, we needed to go to his apartment and move things out of there and get rid of stuff and close down the apartment. And I asked my brother and sister to come up and help me because I couldn't do it myself. It was too emotionally difficult. And so luckily for me, they were able to do that.
Well, Kerry, thank you, Terri. Let's shift to Kerry for just a bit. Kerry, help us understand your caregiving story, what you've done, and how and in what ways your life has been impacted.
Okay, well, first of all, I'll start with saying that at this point, obviously, my husband is a brilliant man.
Yeah.
I don't consider myself a caregiver. I consider myself a care partner. He really doesn't need assistance with the daily living activities. He's very cognizant. Can you hear? Is this better? Okay, thank you. So he is very cognizant that he has this disease, and we can talk about it. And I feel very fortunate that we can talk about it. I will say for us, the diagnosis was a long time coming. He probably displayed symptoms well before he saw the first neurologist. And again, this has been over a 5-year time period, and he has seen 3 different neurologists and has undergone various tests, neuropsych, MRI, PET scans, and we have had a little bit of a different diagnosis with each doctor. And so when he was diagnosed with vascular dementia, we just thought, vascular dementia, well, okay, that's memory loss, and that might be a few other things. We didn't really pay attention to it. I didn't pay attention. I was absorbed at the time with caring for my mother. My mother was diagnosed with COPD 10 years before her death, and so I was her main caregiver. And so our lives were, he was busy, I was busy. We didn't really pay attention to the beginning symptoms. And then in 2017, when he was diagnosed with what we understood to be the beginning stages of Alzheimer's, that's when I think that got our attention. Alzheimer's, oh, okay. We need to learn about this, and we really need to do something about this. Shortly after he was diagnosed, he underwent a surgery and had 2 stents placed. And I believe from my research that there's a direct correlation, can be a direct correlation between anesthesia and a decline in your cognitive function. And he declined last summer a little bit. And then it was more than a little bit. And I thought that was very sudden, from his Alzheimer's diagnosis in May to what happened over the summer. And so we talked about it, and we just devised a plan that we would tackle this together, and we would handle it in the best way possible. And again, I'm very fortunate that he is so open to talking about it. I can't imagine what it would be like if we couldn't deal with this together. So that's a little bit about the diagnosis. I will say it's very important to get the right diagnosis. And if you don't click with your first doctor, your first neurologist, keep searching for the right one and ask a lot of questions. And if the doctor wants to meet with the person who you believe has dementia, if they want to meet with that person alone, insist on being there. If your loved one will let you be in the room, it's important for you to be there. It's important for you to ask questions.
You know, Kerry, I think you're right. You're very lucky to be in a partnership with someone that you can talk to, talk with, have difficult conversations. Help us understand some of the conversations you've had about the what ifs as you experience decline, what options you've discussed, what kind of care alternatives you may have looked at or may even just be talking about.
Well, we tackled the financial and the legal issues first.
Very important.
We knew, I learned from my support group, both in person and online, that was probably a very important aspect to tackle, to take care of that first. If you can take care of your health power of attorney, if you can take care of your financial power of attorney, you really want to sit down and review all of your entire financial situation. And you probably, in our case, we looked at our trusts and our wills on both sides, not just for my husband, but for both of us. And so once we had our ducks in a row there, then we knew that we could handle some of the other, as the issues come along, we knew that we could set that aside, knowing that was taken care of. So that was very important for us.
You mentioned,
I could comment
go ahead.
on that.
Go ahead, Dick.
One thing, I have always been a manager of my own investments and have done pretty well with that, I believe. But once I was aware of my dementia issues, every time I sit down at the computer to make any adjustment in anything financial, Kerry sits down with me so that she is well aware of what I'm doing, but also just in case I reach a time, which I may, in which I think about doing dumb stuff. Okay? And I'm not there by any means, but if you track the disease well enough, you will realize at some point you'll get a call that says, oh, if you'd only give $10,000 to this deal, blah, 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 and you do it, you need to catch that before it happens. And so our system kind of catches all that stuff. So.
And that's a very good point. Thanks for bringing that up, because one of our financial institutions that we deal with, and I would encourage everyone to look into this either with your bank or your brokerage house or whoever you do business with. Once they had a diagnosis of dementia for Dick, and it's on record, then in this case, one of our financial institutions, they put a 24-hour hold on any large transactions. And I think that we were relieved to hear that. And and now every time we speak to a financial institution, we ask them, do you have a policy for those with dementia? Because it's going to happen at some point if you don't have a backup plan in place. So I would encourage everyone to ask that of your financial institution.
Kerry, one last question for you before we open this up for questions from the audience. You mentioned you're involved in a support group. Mm-hmm. Talk to us about the value of that for you. Oh,
it's been invaluable. I had so many questions, and I'll piggyback on what Terri said, and that is that sometimes the worry and the guilt is pretty consuming, and you wonder if you're making the right decisions, and at the same time, you want to have a good quality of life. So you don't want to over worry and take away from what's happening in the day. And so when I have a question or a concern, the in-person support group at the Alzheimer's Association, that's been invaluable. And I'm not a member of an online support group, but there is one. And then if you want to connect with it, it's alzconnect.org. And it's been very important for me to read the stories and to learn from others who have traveled before us.
I'd like to expand just
Go ahead.
For about a minute to talk about this issue of how does the Alzheimer's Association affect people who have the disease. And I'll give you one little instance, and Bob was there at the time. The last time that I was running a little support group, and Bob was in it, and there was a new person who attended. And I had known that person, not well, but I had known him in the community. He's a business owner, and he had come, this was his first meeting, and he sat on the group because everybody in this room, except 2 people I think from the association or volunteers for the association, had some form of dementia. And so that's the group. And at the end of it, he came up to me in the hall and literally cried on my shoulder because he said, this is the first time in my life I have ever sat down with people who I knew had exactly what I had. And that was a really big experience. So I'll just pass that on to you as something you might want to consider.
Well, one thing I knew when I came in here this morning is that there would be way too little time to talk about all the things we'd like to talk about with 4 interesting people. I wish we had another couple hours to just include this, go wherever this conversation would take us. But for now, I'm going to end my role in this